So we received some questions from the audience. The first one goes to both of you. It was stated by Professor Nina Modi, which is in the room here also, and she suggests that it is also important to study lactation from a policy perspective. That means, how can society stop mothers from incurring a pay or career progression gap if they take time off to work and breastfeed? So any comments on that?
So I would agree completely that policy is incredibly important. And I would share with you, we have a breastfeeding strategy at a governmental level in Australia. However, it's relatively impotent due to the fact that there is not a lot of resources being put behind that. And I think also the importance of generating policy is to, again, be integrative and multidisciplinary. So things that are moving towards even implementing that policy that we have in Australia is not good measurement of breastfeeding rates. We only get that at a census at 5 years. So those are things we're working on to help support policy and promote that.
Yeah, I clearly don't have a good answer for it, other than it's complicated. I think that is the not million, but billion-dollar question, probably. How do we do that? And I don't have an answer for it. I think it should always be a question of informed choice. And I would even go one step further. I know that's not the good thing to hear in this room, in this audience, but I would also argue that how do we make infant formula better for the choice of, if a mom says, I do not want, for whatever reason, I don't want to breastfeed, or I don't want to provide human milk, for whatever reason. We still have to make infant formula better as well to give those infants also the best start to life. So I know that's not a well heard point of view, but I think we need to go there as well. And how we provide the right political framework to give women not only the information to make an informed decision, but also to then put a political framework around that to act on those decisions. I think that is very complicated and very different probably from country to country. Speaking from a US perspective, it's going to be very difficult to implement something like that. Might be easier to do that in Europe and other countries. But I think that is the multi-million-dollar question. How can we translate all this information that we are generating and will be generating in the future, whether it's systems biology approach or where it is, how do we put a political framework in place to then actually take that information and give moms and babies the best opportunity to either breastfeed or not, and to give all babies the best start to life? I don't have a better answer than just mumbling around it, but that's unfortunately the truth.
I think incorporating breastfeeding and women's health into the medical model is essential as well, because we see a lot of women with pregnancy complications, for example, even when they're managed really well, 30% will not make enough milk for their babies. So we need a different approach for these women. And what we're seeing is in our studies is that they are breastfeeding out to 6 months at least to the study, whereas they would normally have given up. So I think there's multi-purpose. It's one thing to say breastfeed, but if we don't have a good support, both medical system and community support, we're not going to succeed.
Yeah, thank you very much for commenting on this very important question. And I think the common ground is that it's really complex, right? The next question goes into a completely different direction. So when we speak about environmental factors, the next question asks, to what extent do environmental toxins influence HMOs? Would you like to comment on that, Lars?
Yeah, I would even go a step further and say, how do environmental toxins and environmental exposures in general change milk composition? It's not just oligosaccharides, right? And environmental toxins can be everything from the typical toxins that you think of to certain medications that moms take, supplements even that moms take. How does it change milk composition? And I think we have very limited data on that in general, whether that's human milk in general or human milk oligosaccharides. Not much known about it. That's all I can say to it.
I'd just mention that we did a study, it's a while ago now, on less than a mil of milk. So typically these studies take a lot of milk and pool it. So we looked at mothers, at least with persistent organopesticides, that's DDT and levels like that. So in Australia we had dropped again. So I know those are the older pesticides and people are looking at the newer plastics and things in the milk. But again, yeah, often we need a really good longitudinal study, not just about whether they're in the milk, but whether they are detrimental, because we're all living amongst and consuming these as well. So if that baby's in the same environment, then for the next 18 years, they're going to be exposed to that as well.
Yeah. Thank you both. The next question is from Dr. Hennekin here in the room. What's the sensitivity of HMOs to pasteurization?
Great question. Fortunately, oligosaccharides are not destroyed by pasteurization. They're very robust. In fact, you can apply multiple freeze-thaw cycles, pasteurization, heat inactivation, UV. Oligosaccharides are probably one of the most robust components in human milk, and that includes the silated ones as well, like DSLNT.
Thank you for this clear reply.
For once.
That's really good that we also can give concrete replies, right? The next... So the next question is, to what extent does stress, nutritional deficiencies, lack of access to quality job opportunities affect the variation of oligosaccharides over time? Lars, you're smiling.
Yeah, I think it goes along with the previous question about the toxins.
Yeah.
Right? What do we know about external factors that change milk composition in general, and oligosaccharides in particular? And again, not much known about it, especially for the oligosaccharides. We know a little bit about maternal diet. We know a little bit about physical activity. We start to know a little bit about health status, or gestational diabetes changes oligosaccharides to a certain extent. But there's so many open questions still, and really a lot of need to fill those gaps with good research.
Mm-hmm. The next question comes from Professor Ricardo Davanzo. He asked, shall we expect in the future to supplement mother's milk and donated human milk with the most effective HMOs in order to prevent NEC?
I would say yes, if we could. So if we had this oligosaccharide available, DSLNT, in quantities and also at low enough cost to do that, then yes, I would do that. And I would do that for a preterm infant that is at risk to develop NEC. I think there is an indication to say that human milk in its original state might not be ideal. So adding something to it is important. And we do this with fortifiers anyway. So this would be a very specific fortifier, adding one specific oligosaccharide. But I think there's other opportunities. And I saw there was another question around pooling and milk banking and those kinds of things. If we had a technology to identify individual milk donors and how high and low those concentrations are, we could then pool different donors together to get above that NEC preventing threshold. And we've done a study recently in the US where we sampled 200 active milk donors from a milk bank and saw that 23% of the active donors had below NEC preventing DSLNT concentrations. So that's a lot. A quarter of the donors have not enough DSLNT in the milk to potentially prevent NEC. And of course, we don't know that. But if we know how many or what concentrations are in the different donors, we could then pool them together to get above that threshold with the final product. And I think that's a huge opportunity.
That's amazing and really interesting. Also new learning for me here. The next question is, would there be any negative consequence of adding one single HMO to an already complex system? Would you like to comment on that, Donna?
HMO, I would be repeating probably Lars's opinion that this is where the systems biology approach of modulation and systematic testing is critical preclinically. there is so much more in milk and investigating those interactions, but I'll leave that. It's an HMO thing.
I think the extreme there is 2-fucosylactose, which companies have decided that's the first and oligosaccharide to introduce to infant formula. But it happens to be the oligosaccharide that is either there in high concentrations or it's not there at all. So if we do this with an infant formula product, now some infants that are not really supposed to get this oligosaccharide, at least not from mom, now receive this oligosaccharide. And we don't know what it does, right? Human milk provides 100, 150 different oligosaccharides. And they all work in interaction somehow. We see this for the growth data that you've shown, 2FL positively associated with fat mass. At the same time, neo-LMT always comes with 2FL, and the ratio is very important. So if you only add 2FL, you're missing half of the equation, really. And I think that is kind of a concern, because most of the safety studies that we see are, 15 weeks or something max? What the long-term consequences are, let's say obesity risk, we don't know. We don't test for these things. And we don't know what happens if you only add 2FL, or even if you add 5 different oligosaccharides instead of 150. And then what concentration? Do you add it at the average concentration on what is in human milk, or what oligosaccharide concentrations do you actually add if it's so different from mom to mom?
Yeah, it is. The next question is, how much focus should we place on maternal diet and activity? How much impact does it make to the overall system? Would you like to comment, Donna?
Well, we've been looking at well-being, sleep, with systematic validated questionnaires, particularly in the pandemic when we didn't have a chance to do much work. And we saw in our initial analyses that fell out after multivariate modelling that exercise was critical to the women's well-being during the pandemic and the time spent outside, which gives you kind of an idea. And we also know that sleep is very much entwined with feeding, which is why we have another publication on the way for preterm and sick kids, and looking at how that's, it's virtually entwined with feeding. So to ignore that, that's definitely a well-being thing. It's linked to all of the stress scales. So how mums are sleeping and what they're doing. And we would expect potentially differences in composition, potentially, depending how severe that is.
Yeah, exactly. The next question again goes to you, Donna. In order to improve mothers' confidence, do you recommend to weigh all babies before discharge? And if so, what's the accepted loss weight to maintain only mother's milk?
That's the hard
Another million-dollar question.
The other million-dollar question. What I seem to see is if, our mothers are being sent away from hospital in 24 hours. So you've barely got time to do that. However, there seems to be a tendency to wait 2 weeks for the regain of birth weight, which is not borne out by the literature at all. That would suggest there's milk production problems, and that just waiting during that period is not going to help. We need to know why the baby's not putting on weight, whether that's a baby issue, a milk removal issue by the baby, or a production issue. So this is where we're working in that field for biomarkers rather than having to test weigh a baby for 24 hours, which is prohibitive in most situations. Because remember, I said the components in the milk are reflective of the function. So we're at the moment trying to work on that for a point of care instrument. We've trialled sodium in the NICU, and you can see very quickly when there's a peak in sodium, Rebecca's done some work as well, that things are going awry. Those measurements are important. We've swayed away from them for fear of impacting mother's confidence. That's not what we're experiencing in the clinic, in the model of care for term infants or preterm infants. Clinicians, obstetricians are using it to engage with the mothers and monitor and talk about their journey. We call it a breastfeeding map, now. So because a map is never a straight line, we tend to think in linear terms. So question how much weight, I guess that depends on what's going on, but it's certainly a red flag. And we have a tendency to not look at the averages in those cases, but look at the extreme outlier and think that that's okay for all babies. So I would say when you look at the literature, we need to think about having those conversations earlier, asking the right questions in a way that's not rocking confidence, but supporting the mother in that journey.
Thank you very much for your comment on this. The next question is rather a comment. If we look at breastfeeding as the gold standard for our children, we have to change our view on society, how it's producing opportunities to mothers really to realize breastfeeding without any barriers. And yeah, I think this goes a little bit into this political discussion we had before. So yeah, that we need to change our view on breastfeeding within the society and see the value in it, right? With the next question, I think, Lars, you need to help me out. This one is from Annika Dial, and she wants to know the effect of pasteurization on DSLNT levels, particularly in donor milk compared to fresh breast milk.
Yeah, mentioned that in one of the previous answers. So DSLNT, like most other or all other oligosaccharides, are resistant to degradation through pasteurization. So we're good on that front.
Good. Then a very interesting question. Where do you see the future of the systems approach to lactation heading? What is needed to make this the next standard?
I think what's needed is closing some of the gaps to have a real systems biology approach to lactation. And one of that is simply validating assays to measure milk components, not just concentrations, but really dose. I think that's two very important factors. But then the question is, okay, now we are applying systems biology to human milk and lactation. What are we going to do with that information that comes out of it? That's going to be the key. Yeah. And again, I don't have an answer for it, but it's going to be highly individualized. And I think that's going to be a huge problem in giving recommendations to the public, right? So in other words, the answer is not always straightforward, that what applies to this mother milk infant triad applies to this. It's highly individualized, and giving recommendations on an individualized basis is going to be extremely complicated. It's complicated already just to say, oh, do this or that. But now to say you do this, but you have to do that, it's going to be extremely complicated and extremely difficult. So I'm not so worried about applying a systems biology approach to human milk. It will happen. I think we're going to overcome those barriers. But what are we going to do with that information on so many different levels? Whether it's education, policy, making, whatever it is, that's going to be the real challenge, right?
It is, and that's also the reason why we invited experts from several specialities here, from the government, from the units, to really talk together in the workshops tomorrow also.
I agree, it's the translation, but I think there is a strong drive towards personalised medicine, and that may be a little bit at odds with the public health message, but the public health message is the same. It's providing that personalised translation of the science to the mum and the baby, and I think it's critical that we have tests for normal lactation and for problems, because that, in a sense, will drive that personalised, personalised attention. So, for example, we had a mother in the clinic who gave a drop of milk, had her sodiums tested, and my PhD neonatal nurse said to us, "Oh, your sodium's really high in your right breast." She said, "Oh, it's a little bit sore." I wasn't going to say anything. So we can translate if we have the tools to be able to deliver that personalised medicine, instead of systematically getting the mother to try this, and this, and if it doesn't work, come back in 1 week. So if we can hit the target sooner and more accurately, then we have a better chance of supporting the mother through that journey.
I think these were very nice closing remarks, and I know that Dr. Rebecca Hoban will also elaborate on the impact of biomarkers, right? So, yeah, I would have loved to enjoy it and to discuss this further. So, but yeah, we are running out of time a bit. So I would say a big, big thank you to both of our speakers. A big applause for Professor Lars Bodhi and Donna Geddes.
Thank you.